evening. The Battle of Gettysburg is regarded by many as one of the decisive engagements of the Civil War. In early July 1863, after 3 bloody days of battle, Robert E. Lee lost the battle, lost the strategic initiative, and some even claimed that he lost the war. As Lee and his beaten, weary army staggered back to Virginia, recriminations began to emerge regarding the outcome of the battle within the rank and file, the newspapers, and the drawing rooms in Richmond. 3 Confederate generals quickly emerged as potential reasons for the Southern failure at Gettysburg. James Ewell Brown Stuart failed to provide his chief with timely intelligence and didn't reach Gettysburg until the night of July 2nd. Richard Pegleg Ewell is often blamed for his failure to push the offensive as the sun was setting beyond South Mountain on July 1st, preventing Lee and his legion from securing the high ground at Cemetery Hill. The 3rd general who often receives principal blame for the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg is the South Carolinian often associated with the state of Georgia. James Pete Longstreet, Lee's old warhorse, endured withering criticism for his generalship at Gettysburg beginning in the 1870s and continuing until his death in 1904. Historians such as Douglas Freeman and Clifford Doughty criticized Longstreet in their examinations of Old Pete's generalship. Few came to Longstreet's defense. After his death, his wife, Helen Dortch, defended her husband in her book, Lee and Longstreet at High Tide. Ironically, too, another Georgian who described Longstreet as a humbug after Gettysburg sought to defend him after the war. Our speaker tonight, Mr. Cory Pfarr, has examined the relationship between Longstreet and his supporter, Lafayette McLaws, a Georgian by birth, and is here to share his insights and thoughts on the saga of McLaws' commentary regarding Longstreet at Gettysburg. Welcome.
Thank you, Sherry, for that introduction. Appreciate it. It's great to be here with you all. Really an honor and pleasure to speak to you this evening. Before I get started, can everybody hear that? Okay, very good. Before I get started, I just want to thank Mr. David Ward for coordinating everything to get me here. And also I want to thank the president as well of the Civil Roundtable, Mark. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. So with further ado, since I know why you're all here, let's get right into it because I know we have limited time. So if there's one question, there we go. If there's one question that consistently pops up concerning the historiography of James Longstreet's actions at the Battle of Gettysburg, and rightfully so, it is, who do we trust? Who do we trust when it comes to a topic so fraught with the trappings of agenda going back to the early 1870s? If we were to entirely discard the main players' testimonies and writings, Jubal Early's, William Pendleton's, Longstreet's, and a few others, out of an abundance of caution, lessening the possibility of encountering partiality, who's left? Who's most capable of shooting straight with us and putting aside subjectivity and egotism? For students of the war and historians who now look back on this controversial topic nearly 160 years later, with intent to pursue objectivity and reveal cold truths, is there a participant at the battle who both personally observed Longstreet's conduct at Gettysburg and wrote objectively about those observations in the days, months, and years following the battle? In researching, writing, and speaking about this topic for several years now, and upon weighing the totality of the evidence, I would argue that such an individual does exist. I would contend that the person who proved himself most adept at advancing impartial testimony on this topic is none other than Major General Lafayette McLaws, who served under Longstreet for the majority of the war and as one of Longstreet's division commanders at Gettysburg. Before we delve into the why, I want to offer some background and context about Longstreet and McLaws' relationship and McLaws' rather significant role during the second day's battle at Gettysburg. First of all, the similarities between both men are quite uncanny. Both men were born in January 1821, just 7 days apart, and both grew up in the Augusta, Georgia area. Of course, Longstreet was born just across the Savannah River in Edgefield District, South Carolina, but he spent most of his youth in Augusta. Longstreet and McLaws attended the Academy of Richmond County in their adolescent years, where they both received a classical education of sorts. Both also attended the United States Military Academy at West Point between the years 1838 and 1842, graduating toward the bottom of their class, as each were rather average students academically. Both men also pursued careers as infantry officers, and it's interesting to note that Longstreet edged out McLaws at West Point in infantry tactics, finishing 40th out of 56 cadets, whereas McLaws finished 50th, perhaps a sign of things to come. So the two men not only favored each other physically, they also grew up with one another in Georgia and led seemingly parallel lives up until their attendance at West Point together. For the sake of time, let's skip ahead to the Civil War years. Both men were active early participants in the war's Eastern Theater. By the time of the 7 Days Campaign, when Robert E. Lee took over command from a wounded Joseph E. Johnston, following the Battle of Seven Pines, and aggressively struck back at federal forces arrayed outside Richmond, Longstreet had established himself as one of Lee's key subordinates, and McLaws was placed under his childhood friend's command as a division officer during the post-campaign reorganization. And that's where McLaws stayed and found himself going into the Army of Northern Virginia's summer 1863 campaign, which saw its crescendo at Gettysburg from July 1st to July 3rd. During the first day's battle, west and north of Gettysburg, when the Confederates victoriously pushed advance elements of the Federal Army back through the town and onto high ground on Cemetery Hill and Ridge, McLaws' division of Longstreet's corps was absent from the action. It was busy marching east toward Gettysburg, doing its best to navigate an extremely congested Chambersburg pike. Despite the relative inaction McLaws' division experienced on July 1st, it played a major role in the second day's fight, of course. More details will follow, however, suffice to say for now, McLaws' division served as one of two divisions in Longstreet's Confederate First Corps that attacked the Federal left on July 2nd, the other being John Bell Hood's division, of course. McLaws' brigades of Joseph Kershaw, Paul Semmes, William Barksdale, and William Wofford fought in several notable locations on the battlefield, to include the Wheat Field, Rose Woods, Stony Hill, and the Peach Orchard. I'm going to take this off if you guys don't mind. In many respects, McLaws' brigades achieved great initial success against Federal forces at the number of these intermediary locations, especially at the Peach Orchard and along the Emmitsburg Road. However, as they pushed forward and attempted to seize Cemetery Ridge, their inertia slowed, cohesion dissipated, and they were ultimately thrown back. On the third day's fight, which culminated in the infamous Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble charge against the Federal center, McLaws' division played no significant active role. So with a firm grasp of Longstreet and McLaws' nearly parallel lives in the lead up to Gettysburg, and a solid understanding of McLaws' general role during the battle, we now turn to this presentation's main argument, that being, why should Lafayette McLaws be considered one of the best candidates to provide objective testimony about Longstreet's Gettysburg performance, particularly Longstreet's actions during the most consequential day of the battle, in my mind, July 2nd. As post-Gettysburg events demonstrated, McLaws had every, and I mean every reason, to join the post-war group of ex-Confederates who attacked and attempted to blame Longstreet for the Confederate loss at Gettysburg in the years after Lee's 1870 death. However, McLaws did not do so. In fact, despite any personal misgivings against Longstreet, McLaws largely did the opposite in his post-war writings. Most of McLaws' post-war commentary on Longstreet's Gettysburg performance is arguably quite supportive of this former commander. You may be wondering, Why would I say McLaws had every reason to join the post-war anti-Longstreet group? Well, two major events stand out. The first is a letter McLaws sent his wife just 4 days after the battle on July 7th, 1863, where McLaws made it amply clear he was unimpressed with Longstreet's Gettysburg performance. Countless historians have drawn attention to this letter's contents in the last century, repeatedly using as unquestionable proof that Longstreet was acting up and seriously off his game at Gettysburg. Yet, as we will cover shortly, there are actually several issues with McLaws' accusations against Longstreet in his post-battle letter. Even so, given the emotional intensity and some of McLaws' post-battle claims, one might assume he carried those feelings for the rest of his life. But the evidence suggests he did not. He did not. Indeed, what's most often missing, and I would argue critically so, from the historiography on Longstreet at Gettysburg is McLaws' post-war commentary on Longstreet's performance, which contradicts nearly all of what he penned in his post-battle letter. The second major issue that might have induced McLaws to seriously consider joining the post-war anti-Longstreet partisans concerning Gettysburg was the rapid breakdown of McLaws' post-Gettysburg relationship with Longstreet. Not only did the relationship fail to improve, but it near permanently ruptured just a few months later. During Longstreet's late 1863 East Tennessee campaign, he unfairly blamed McLaws for the Confederates' failed attack on Knoxville's Fort Sanders. Longstreet essentially scapegoated McLaws for things that transpired during the preparation for and execution of the Fort Sanders attack that were, at least in part, Longstreet's responsibility. The crux of contention lied in the seemingly neglectful absence of critical supplies required by the attacking column to scale the combined height of a ditch in front of and a parapet around Fort Sanders. The ditch's depth, see it here in front, and parapet's height were open concerns in the lead up to the attack, and Longstreet discussed the issue with McLaws and others beforehand. However, based on Longstreet's and additional reconnaissance officers' subsequent mistaken observations, the ditch was ultimately deemed not a serious enough obstacle to warrant the issuance of ladders for scaling or stick bundles for filling the ditch. Consequently, when the brief attack was made on the morning of November 29, 1863, the men essentially advanced to the ditch and no further, dearly costing the Confederates 813 casualties to the Federals' mere 13. Nevertheless, by the end of 1863, Longstreet had seen fit to relieve McLaws of command, charging him with neglect of duty for his alleged conduct during the Fort Sanders assault. McLaws proceeded to adamantly defend himself and even personally demanded a court-martial, which was ultimately granted, with McLaws' case appearing before a court in March of 1864. Of the three accusations leveled against McLaws' actions at Knoxville, he was only charged with the third, and even that verdict was ultimately thrown out by the Confederate government. Even though he was formally vindicated, McLaws never again served in Longstreet's First Corps. Before we continue, it's extremely important to grasp and consider the extent of McLaws' ire against Longstreet during this time period. In hearing what McLaws wrote about Longstreet in early 1864, which I will recount momentarily, contemplate how easy it would have been for McLaws to join the cacophony of voices against Longstreet's Gettysburg record in the 1870s. On January 17, 1864, McLaws wrote assuredly to the Adjutant and Inspector General of the Confederacy, Samuel Cooper, the highest ranking officer in the Confederacy, quote, "I do not hold myself responsible and hold myself unjustly charged, and I object to being put forward as a blind," meaning scapegoat, "to draw attention away from the main issue, which is the conduct of the campaign in East Tennessee under General Longstreet," unquote. In a letter to his wife 2 months later, written just before the trial, McLaws described the charges against him as nothing more than, quote, "General Longstreet's scheme to injure me, false impressions made by Longstreet emissaries, and slanderous, malicious, and evil." Those are McLaws' words. Specifically addressing the issue of Fort Sanders ditch and the provision of ladders during the attack, McLaws wrote privately in early 1864, quote, "General Longstreet must have known the depth of the ditch, or why does he charge the facts against me? And if he did know, he is the criminal for ordering the assault in an impracticable place and not informing me of it so that ladders might be prepared to overcome the difficulty," unquote. Indeed, McLaws came to be so dismayed with Longstreet's charges that he went beyond forthrightly contending that his former commander was the criminal and proceeded to assert even more boldly that, quote, "Under these circumstances, I thought the assault was highly injudicious, to say the least, and I believe that an indictment for murder against General L would stand before any impartial jury," unquote. A criminal, an indictment for murder. Do you think McLaws is perhaps just a bit better with Longstreet by the spring of 1864? So now that we've made the case for why McLaws might have been a shoo-in to join the group of ex-Confederates who were critical of Longstreet's Gettysburg performance after Lee's death, we'll proceed to analyze McLaws' writings on Gettysburg, which include his July 7, 1863 letter to his wife and several post-war accounts, the first and most prominently being a lengthy commentary published in the Southern Historical Society papers in January of 1879. Let's start with his 1863 letter. This letter serves as a great tool to contrast and compare what McLaws wrote about Longstreet just following the battle, when he was in an emotionally charged state, with what he wrote 15 years later after he had time to cool off and reflect upon events. The first thing that stands out in McLaws' letter is a statement that he thought the July 2nd attack was unnecessary and the whole plan of battle a very bad one. Note here that McLaws never mentioned Robert E. Lee's name in connection with either the July 2nd attack plan or the whole plan of battle, even though both originated with Lee. Lee insisted on the July 2nd and 3rd attacks, and the tactical battle plan at Gettysburg was certainly Lee's conception. Yet in McLaws' next sentence, the only person he drew attention to was Longstreet, charging his superior, a corps commander, with insufficiently reconnoitering the ground on July 2nd prior to the Confederates' attack on the Federal left. As we will see, McLaws ascribed blame much differently on this point in his post-war accounts. Indeed, there were numerous Confederate reconnaissance missions by several officers, including Longstreet, Lee, and even McLaws himself in the lead up to the July 2nd attack. And collectively, they provided the Confederate High Command with a great deal of information. However, unfortunately for the Confederates, as McLaws later emphasized, and we will discuss here tonight, much of the information provided simply proved to be poor, misguided, or outdated through no fault of any one person. McLaws rounded out this series of accusations against Longstreet in his letter with the charge that Longstreet persisted in ordering the July 2nd attack, even after his so-called errors were discovered. The so-called errors to which McLaws referred here were mentioned earlier in his letter, namely that before the Confederates arrived at their attack jump-off points on Lower Seminary Ridge, they were operating under the mistaken impression, based on false intelligence, that only a very small federal force occupied ground south of Cemetery Hill. However, once McLaws' leading brigades arrived, McLaws found a much different situation. He observed a sizable federal force positioned right in his front at the Peach Orchard and along the Emmitsburg Road. In his post-battle letter, McLaws solely criticized Longstreet for issuing repeated orders to immediately attack after his leading brigades arrived at the front and just after observing the unanticipated battlescape. McLaws repeatedly attempted to inform Longstreet of the unforeseen situation, but Longstreet kept ordering him to commence the attack. In covering this topic in his letter, McLaws is presenting a fresh and myopic perspective and solely blaming Longstreet for issuing these premature attack orders, something he would correct in his post-war commentary. Indeed, as McLaws would later write, and subsequently confirmed by others who were on the scene, Robert E. Lee wanted the assault made immediately and was joining in Longstreet's repeated orders to attack. So again, if you only read McLaws' post-battle letter and fail to cross-reference it with his post-war commentary, as many historians have seemingly done over the decades, you would walk away with a skewed interpretation of Longstreet's actions during this controversial point in the battle. The last part of McLaws' post-battle letter we need to examine is the now well-known emotionally charged section where he attacks Longstreet on a rather personal level. This part is important because, again, when juxtaposing it with McLaws' later writings, you not only clearly see how McLaws' anger fueled and perhaps clouded his judgment just a few days after the battle, but you also gain an appreciation for the significant dichotomy in McLaws' analysis of Longstreet's conduct at Gettysburg between 1863 and the 1870s. McLaws' comments in this section once again demonstrate his constrained perspective of events. Since he was unaware of certain orders Lee had issued to Longstreet concerning McLaws' division during the summer 1863 campaign. For instance, McLaws led off this section with the accusation that during the battle, Longstreet was excited and exceedingly overbearing. McLaws was essentially suggesting that Longstreet micromanaged his division during the second day's fight. McLaws was accurate in his observation that Longstreet spent most of his time on McLaws' front on July 2nd. But what he did not know was the reason for that behavior. As Longstreet informed McLaws years later, Lee had specifically instructed Longstreet to keep a close watch on McLaws and his division. In short, Lee was not sold on McLaws in the lead up to Gettysburg. There was a perception that McLaws lacked initiative, was slow to engage in battle, and too careful in the face of greater strength. There were swirling allegations in the lead up to the summer 1863 campaign concerning McLaws' perceived tardiness in relieving John Bell Hood's division at the September 1862 Battle of Antietam. Evidence for this particular claim was always tenuous, but the perception about McLaws' alleged lethargy was nevertheless established and seemed to be confirmed during the recent Chancellorsville campaign in May 1863. At Salem Church on May 3rd, McLaws did not attack as aggressively as Lee had wished in cooperation with Jubal Early and Richard Anderson's commands. Lee was apparently so disappointed with McLaws that he indirectly criticized him in his official battle report. The last piece of McLaws' letter that we need to discuss is his well-known passionate statement about Longstreet's character and personality. As you can see on the screen, McLaws thought Longstreet was a humbug, a man of small capacity, very obstinate, unchivalrous, exceedingly conceited, totally selfish. By far, this is the most cited quote of anything McLaws ever wrote in his entire lifetime, this quote. Historians have included this statement in pretty much every book concerning either Gettysburg or Longstreet. Granted, its inclusion is rather unsurprising, given its inherent emotionally persuasive appeal. It jumps right off the page. However, let's unpack this quotation a bit and keep it in its proper context and perspective. First and foremost, McLaws' statement once again provides insight into just how frustrated and upset he was with Longstreet during and immediately after Gettysburg. Second, it was undoubtedly a sign of things to come in their personal and professional relationship, culminating in the Knoxville controversy a few months later. Third, it's worth emphasizing this statement's placement in McLaws' letter. He penned it immediately after charging Longstreet with being overbearing during the July 2nd attack. Therefore, this statement can best be characterized as an emotional outburst stemming from McLaws' belief that Longstreet micromanaged his division on July 2nd. McLaws was not unreasonable in feeling this way. Longstreet did play a very active role, perhaps too active a role, in handling McLaws' division on July 2nd, to include directing when and where McLaws' brigade should attack, and even personally leading some of them forward. Again, it should be reiterated that at the time, McLaws was unaware that Lee had specifically instructed Longstreet to keep a close eye on McLaws during the campaign. Besides these takeaways, from a rational standpoint, what else can we glean from McLaws' emotive statement? Over the decades, historians have repeatedly used this statement as some sort of concrete proof that irrefutably brings into question Longstreet's conduct at Gettysburg. However, I would ask, what real insight or practical value does it ultimately offer? More importantly, did McLaws go on to replicate even the spirit of this emotional outburst in his post-war Gettysburg commentary? As we will see, the answer is an emphatic no. In fact, McLaws went on to praise much of Longstreet's personal conduct during the July 2nd attack. So without further ado, let's jump into the post-war years. As the story goes, the Longstreet-Gettysburg controversy, as we know it, began in the 1870s, specifically in the years just after Robert E. Lee's death in October 1870. Longstreet had contributed some interviews in 1866 for a book publication, in which he made some comments about his and Lee's tactical differences at Gettysburg, and Lee's generalship that ultimately did not sit well with some other ex-Confederates who had served under Lee, like Jubal Early and William Pendleton, for instance. Longstreet also turned out to be a controversial figure more generally in the South because of some political decisions and statements he made beginning in 1867, specifically his call for reconciliation with the North and Southern cooperation with the leading Northern political party at the time, the Republicans. Longstreet ultimately became a Republican himself, holding several positions in Republican administrations, to include a brief stint in 1880 as Minister to Turkey under the Rutherford B. Hayes administration. Collectively, these political decisions did not endear himself with many ex-Confederates and much of the Southern people. So once Lee died in 1870, these other ex-Confederates like Early, Pendleton, and a few others apparently thought the time right to make their own public comments about Gettysburg. In so doing, they began to largely point their fingers at Longstreet for doing or not doing various things at Gettysburg, which they believed ultimately cost the Confederates a victory. It's important to remember that this was very much a time when most ex-Confederates believed Robert E. Lee never made one military mistake or incorrect decision throughout the entirety of the war. Lee worship was strong at the time. They refused to believe any wrongdoing by Lee at Gettysburg, then considered the most important battle of the war and the Confederacy's high tide. Someone else had to be to blame for that critical loss. Thus, the focus turned on Longstreet, Lee's senior subordinate at Gettysburg, and now in much of the Southern people's eyes, a traitorous post-war Republican. The general line of thinking was that if Longstreet betrayed the South after the war in supporting and joining the Republicans, then he must have betrayed it during the war, and most consequentially at Gettysburg. Thus, with some fits and starts, the Longstreet-Gettysburg controversy would rage on for decades, right up until the general's death in 1904 and beyond. But it got its start in the early 1870s when William Pendleton and Jubal Early advanced their infamous July 2nd, 1863 Sunrise attack claim. This allegation, put simply, held that Longstreet disobeyed Lee's order to attack the Federals at sunrise on July 2nd. Longstreet did not officially respond in print to Pendleton and Early's claims until 1876. However, he began collecting information on Gettysburg as early as the summer of 1873. Re-enter Lafayette McLaws. In June and July 1873, 10 years to the month after the Battle of Gettysburg, Longstreet and McLaws reconnected via correspondence. Longstreet was deeply involved in Louisiana state politics, but he and his family were then spending the summer in Lynchburg, Virginia, to avoid the yellow fever season in New Orleans. Meanwhile, in the decade since the war, McLaws had returned to Georgia and pursued various professions in an attempt to make ends meet for his family, to include clerk of Richmond County Superior and Inferior Courts, farming, and selling life insurance and real estate. Longstreet and McLaws' private exchange in 1873 peaked on June 12th, when McLaws sent Longstreet a rather detailed account of his Gettysburg recollections. In it, McLaws completely repudiated Pendleton and Early's sunrise attack claims, just as several other key Confederate officers who were at Gettysburg also did in the mid-1870s. More significantly, McLaws advanced a critical observation he would further develop in his lengthy 1879 account for public circulation. Some of the anti-Longstreet group's mainstays, which persist in one form or another even to the present day, were that Longstreet simply moved too slowly at Gettysburg, sulked and dragged his feet, and intentionally tried to delay or stop Lee's tactical plans for July 2nd and 3rd. McLaws was not buying it and assured Longstreet that he remembered his former commander moving as rapidly as possible on July 2nd, being delayed only by Lee's orders that Longstreet's men arrive at the front via a concealed route. Should McLaws' objectivity surprise us, given he and Longstreet's contentious history? Had McLaws forgiven Longstreet for everything that happened between late 1863 and early 1864. Evidence suggests McLaws continued to resent Longstreet's treatment toward him in East Tennessee until his death in 1897. However, McLaws' objectivity should not surprise us. McLaws revealed a lot about himself and the way he handled arguments, controversies, and disputes as early as March 1864, at the time of his court-martial trial. At the time, in writing to his wife, McLaws described how there were some key Confederate government officials and fellow Confederate officers who were sympathetic to his grievances against Longstreet's charges, even to the point that a discernible faction was forming. Where most people would probably welcome the forming of such a faction and appreciate the expressed support during such a difficult and stressful time, McLaws was decidedly uninterested. He wrote, quote, "But yet I will not join a faction in doing it," referring to defending himself, "but will make my own movement and on my own responsibility." I've added the emphasis to this revealing quotation. Notice McLaws' use of "my own" twice. McLaws was his own man. Applied to the controversy Longstreet found himself in the 1870s concerning Gettysburg, McLaws appears to have not let prior disputes with Longstreet or any personal antipathy toward him cloud his resolve to recall and articulate events as objectively as possible. One historian who has written very critically of Longstreet in the modern era is contended that McLaws provides key testimony about Longstreet at Gettysburg. This historian has further emphasized that McLaws was also, quote, "one of the most pointed detractors Longstreet ever earned," unquote. Perhaps surprisingly, I would agree with this historian's assessment, however, not quite as presented. McLaws did provide key testimony about Longstreet's Gettysburg performance, but that testimony has never been limited to his post-battle letter, which we have already addressed and analyzed at length. McLaws' post-war writings also need to be considered, especially his earliest and lengthiest public account published in 1879. Curiously, in the endnotes for this particular historian's work, there is clear reference to McLaws' post-battle letter, but none whatsoever to his 1879 account. A strict reliance on the letter obfuscates, perhaps willingly, that McLaws' interpretation of events clearly changed after he had years to reflect upon what happened at Gettysburg. Concerning McLaws, it's well beyond time that the full breadth of his commentary, both his post-battle letter and post-war recollections, be considered. Furthermore, McLaws did indeed turn out to be one of Longstreet's biggest detractors. We have already covered the reasons why that was the case. That said, the fact that in the 1870s, McLaws remained bitter toward Longstreet's treatment of him in late 1863 and early 1864, but still managed to repress that bitterness and treat the Gettysburg subject with some care and objectivity, I think, significantly boosts McLaws' reliability as an impartial source over many other Confederate participants' accounts. It's worth noting that in the introduction of McLaws' 1879 account, the editor of the Southern Historical Society papers felt it necessary to pen a disclaimer informing the reader that they had printed McLaws' paper just as it was received. However, they suggested McLaws probably would have altered his account before sending it to them if he had read others' accounts. One must remember that much of what the Southern Historical Society printed about the Longstreet-Gettysburg controversy in the post-war years was overwhelmingly critical of Longstreet. With this reality in mind, the Society's reason for including the disclaimer becomes more easily discernible. They were prepping the reader beforehand of their belief that some of McLaws' commentary was inaccurate, very likely because, as we will see, his commentary at least somewhat exonerated Longstreet from many of the charges other contributors had advanced in the 1870s. And so we'll now wade into McLaws' post-war recollections, which hold many largely untapped insights into Longstreet's Gettysburg conduct. We don't have the time to conduct an exhaustive analysis of McLaws' commentary. However, there are 4 key takeaways from his commentary that we'll briefly discuss this evening. Additionally, we will remain focused on McLaws' recollections of Longstreet's conduct on July 2nd, since not only do I believe it was the most critical day of the battle, but it was also the day that saw McLaws' division most active and McLaws working most closely with Longstreet. First key takeaway from McLaws' post-war commentary is that Lee's primary objective in the lead up to Longstreet's July 2nd attack was concealment, not speed. And it was this objective that most heavily impacted and delayed Longstreet's attack. McLaws made it clear that when he arrived with his division on the outskirts of Gettysburg around the 8 a.m. hour, 8 a.m. on July 2nd, he immediately met with Lee and Longstreet. It was during this meeting that Lee told McLaws that he ultimately wanted his division to take a position on what was then the extreme Confederate right and place his men across or perpendicular to the Emmitsburg Road. The fulcrum of this entire plan, though, was soon revealed when Lee told McLaws that he wanted his division to get to that position without being seen by the enemy. Concealment. Lee is talking about concealment here at a very early hour. Contrary to many historians' suggestions over the decades for what Longstreet or McLaws should have done on the morning of July 2nd, Lee's concealment directive tied their hands. It meant that McLaws was not to move to his attack jump-off points immediately, aggressively, without care for hiding his movement. No, secrecy was the order of the hour here, per Lee's instructions. McLaws wrote revealingly on this matter, quote, "When I had the brief interview with General Lee before mentioned, he did not appear to be particularly anxious that Longstreet should occupy the left. He certainly was in no hurry for it," unquote. But that was not all Lee said about concealment during this brief meeting with McLaws and Longstreet. When Lee asked if McLaws could get to that point, meaning the position perpendicular to the Emmitsburg Road, McLaws stated he knew of nothing to prevent him getting there, but wanted to send some skirmishers or a scouting party ahead to reconnoiter. Lee's reply here is critical to understanding much of what happened on Longstreet's front in the remainder of the morning and early afternoon hours. Listen to this reply as recounted by McLaws. Lee said to him, quote, "Major Johnston of my staff has been ordered to reconnoiter the ground, and I expect he is about ready," unquote. So here's Lee, likely around the 8 a.m. hour, telling McLaws that Johnston was not returning from a reconnaissance. Rather, he was about ready to engage in a new one. Of course, Johnston, with one of Longstreet's engineers, Major John Clark, and perhaps a few others, had already reconned the Federal left earlier in the morning. They returned and provided the misleading but extremely consequential intelligence to Lee that there was no major Federal force south of Cemetery Hill. It was only with this intelligence in hand that it would have been possible for Lee to tell McLaws around the 8 a.m. hour that he wanted the division to move to the right and take a position perpendicular to the Emmitsburg Road, aiming towards Cemetery Hill. So many Gettysburg historians have only included and discussed Johnston's first reconnaissance mission on July 2nd, prior to McLaws meeting with Lee around 8 a.m. What they very often do not include critically is Johnston's second reconnaissance, specifically to scout for a concealed route, which according to McLaws was carried out for much of the remainder of the morning hours. So when did Johnston actually return from the second reconnaissance and approach McLaws? Does McLaws include that information in his account? He does. Skipping ahead in McLaws' narrative, we learn that McLaws asked Lee if he could go with Johnston on this reconnaissance. This is when Longstreet stepped in and said he did not want McLaws to leave his division. Minutes later, McLaws attempted to send one of his engineers to join Johnston, but he was also sent back, presumably by Longstreet. McLaws then admitted that he disobeyed Longstreet's instructions and went forward anyway himself to reconnoiter and gather information. McLaws alleged that he quickly found a concealed route that his division could use, believing it could get to the point Lee specified in secrecy within half an hour. But remember, McLaws had been instructed to await the return of Johnston's party, whose primary objective was to identify a route for Longstreet's infantry to march concealed to its attack jump-off points on Lower Seminary Ridge. Indeed, in another post-war account, McLaws clearly expressed, quote, "General Lee then remarked that he had ordered a reconnaissance for the purpose of finding out a way to go into position without being seen by the enemy, and I must hold myself in readiness to move," unquote. I must hold myself in readiness to move. It cannot get any clearer than that. And hold McLaws did. He indicated that after his personal reconnaissance, he proceeded to the head of his column and sat on his horse for much of the morning, reportedly watching additional enemy units arriving on the field as the hours progressed. So when did Johnston return? McLaws recollected it was about 1 p.m. when Johnston approached him. Some would probably contest McLaws' recollection of 1 p.m. as being too late. However, even if it was an entire hour off and Johnston came to him at 12 noon, that still leaves not one precious morning minute left. Indeed, not one of those so-called golden minutes when many have suggested Longstreet could have or should have attacked. Other factors precluding Longstreet from attacking in the morning are now well known, to include most prominently Lee's indecision over what to do with Richard Ewell's corps on the Confederate left, whether to initiate the attack from Ewell's sector or Longstreet's, or even whether Ewell's corps should be moved around to the right to support Longstreet. According to Longstreet and others on his front, Lee did not even issue Longstreet any attack orders until 11 a.m. And then, of course, we have Longstreet's request, which Lee expressly granted, to wait the arrival of Vander Law's brigade of Hood's division before commencing the movement. But all of this to say, we should not be quick to discount or simply ignore McLaws' key testimony here, that he had been holding himself in readiness to move, while Johnston was contemplating his concealed route reconnaissance as ordered by Lee, and that Johnston did not approach him until the early afternoon. The last part of this first key takeaway concerns what McLaws contended next in his account. So we have Johnston finally approaching McLaws in the early afternoon hours, but then what? Well, McLaws says plainly that Johnston told him that he, being Johnston, was ordered to conduct me on the march. In other words, Lee ordered Johnston to conduct Longstreet's column along the concealed route that Johnston had apparently identified. It makes sense. Who other than the person who had been tasked with finding the alleged concealed route would be better equipped to conduct the column along the concealed route? Some historians have rather strangely expressed their belief that Longstreet should have been at the head of the column, presumably leading it. Others contend it was never Lee's intention that Johnston be at the head of the column, leading it, but here in McLaws' key testimony, the division commander, who was most deeply involved in what was going on at the front, clearly says otherwise. There's more to the story, to include the fact that Johnston's presumed route turned out to be not so concealed after all, and led Longstreet's column to an exposed point, which necessitated a countermarch that cost the Confederates additional time. McLaws ultimately dubbed Lee's insistence on marching the column to its attack jump-off points without being seen by the Federals as a millstone around Longstreet's neck. Now, Merriam-Webster's secondary definition of millstone is a heavy burden, but I was looking for something with a bit more detail. Britannica Dictionary defines a millstone as a problem or responsibility that does not go away and that makes it difficult or impossible to do or achieve something. That definition gets closer to the heart of the issue with Lee's July 2nd focus on concealment. It did become a responsibility that failed to go away. McLaws' commentary suggests that from the time he met with Lee around the 8 a.m. hour until as late as 1 p.m., the Confederates were dealing with trying to find out a way to get into position without being seen by the Federals. The focus on concealment continued to dog the Confederates during the march, causing the holdup near Black Horse Tavern and ultimately forcing a countermarch. The focus on concealment did make it difficult, or rather impossible, to do or achieve what the Confederates intended, which was to get at the Federal left flank in as opportune and timely a manner as possible. Yes, Lee's focus on concealment was indeed a millstone around Longstreet's neck on July 2nd, and largely because of it, the Confederates would not arrive in the vicinity of their attack jump-off points until the 3 p.m. hour. Moving on. Second key takeaway from McLaws' post-war commentary concerns an issue we touched upon earlier. Longstreet's repeated attack orders to McLaws shortly after the division commander arrived with his brigades on Lower Seminary Ridge. Let's return to this topic briefly. You'll recall that this was the moment when McLaws, upon examining his front, noticed much more than a federal regiment and a battery of artillery, but instead a rather large federal force concentrated at the Peach Orchard and along the Emmitsburg Road. This force was, of course, Daniel Sickles' Federal Third Corps, which during the 2 p.m. hour had moved out from its initial position on Lower Cemetery Ridge to what Sickles considered better ground at the Emmitsburg Road. Despite this, McLaws began receiving a series of orders from Longstreet to commence the attack immediately. McLaws attempted to explain the situation to Longstreet's staff officer, Major Osmond Latrobe, who delivered the orders and petitioned Longstreet to come see for himself. But soon thereafter, McLaws received the same order, attack, but it was a bit different this time. McLaws revealed the key difference in his post-war commentary, recalling how this time Latrobe told McLaws that it was not just Longstreet issuing the attack order, but that Lee, quote, joined in the order, unquote. With McLaws understanding that the commanding general was now in the equation, all protest evaporated, and he immediately sent word that within 5 minutes he would set the attack in motion. A few minutes later, however, another courier dashed up to McLaws to tell him to hold off for now. Lee and Longstreet had caught on to the changed battlescape and the need for last-minute tactical alterations, resulting in moving Hood's division from behind McLaws over to McLaws' right, another story for another day. The main historiographical issue here is that so many historians over the years have either knowingly or unknowingly pushed the falsehood that Longstreet and Longstreet alone unilaterally issued what were soon discovered to be premature orders for McLaws to attack. No, McLaws, the man on the spot, made it clear Lee was with Longstreet and at least joined in the order, if he was not the originator himself. The third key takeaway for the evening here from McLaws' post-war recollections involves McLaws' impression of Longstreet's personal conduct and leadership during the July 2nd attack. Remember McLaws' extremely negative impression of Longstreet in the days following the battle, claiming Longstreet was excited and overbearing, a humbug, a man of small capacity, obstinate, and so on and so forth. Remember also, I said that these comments on Longstreet have turned out to be the most circulated of anything McLaws ever wrote in his entire lifetime. Well, what then do we make of McLaws' post-war recollection of Longstreet's personal conduct and leadership that alleged almost the exact opposite? In 1879, McLaws wrote of Longstreet's bearing during the advance of William Wofford's brigade, the last of McLaws' brigades to be sent in on July 2nd. Quote, at the commencement of the charge, General Longstreet went forward some distance with Wofford's brigade, urging them on by voice and his personal example to the most earnest efforts. The troops needed no outside impulse, but his conduct was gallant and inspiring. Gallant and inspiring. A far cry from exceedingly conceited and totally selfish. Why has the latter been included in nearly every book on Gettysburg and Longstreet, while the former has been in almost none? It should be clear to every historian and student of the war seeking objectivity that both should be present, with contextual explanation for each. The last key takeaway from McLaws' post-war commentary addresses the repercussions of the Confederates' reconnaissance and the information gathering efforts in the lead up to Longstreet's July 2nd attack. Recall how in his post-battle letter, McLaws came out swinging at Longstreet, telling his wife that he was to blame for not reconnoitering the ground. McLaws implied that the ground off to the extreme Confederate right and the Federal left had not been sufficiently reconnoitered, and he put that blame squarely on Longstreet's shoulders. Reflecting on events 15 years later, McLaws' analysis was completely different. Longstreet was no longer the main culprit. In fact, McLaws thought no one person was to blame for the Confederate failures in the lead up to Longstreet's July 2nd attack. Rather, he blamed improper reconnaissance, poor information, and what he called, quote, the force of circumstances, the force of circumstances. On the first point, improper reconnaissance, McLaws stated outright that he thought the other post-war writers who were then attempting to put the blame on Longstreet's corps for their ultimately unsuccessful July 2nd and 3rd attacks were, quote, entirely ignorant of the difficulties which his, referring to Longstreet's troops, had to encounter, unquote. And he specifically named the principal issue that plagued Confederate efforts on Longstreet's front. It was no longer General Longstreet and his not reconnoitering the ground enough, Rather, it was the, quote, want of proper reconnaissance having been made before the general plan of attack had been determined on. Get back to the map. There we go. Put a map up on the screen of just how many Confederate reconnaissance missions were conducted on the southern end of the battlefield from the evening of July 1st to the afternoon of July 2nd, and by whom. We don't have time, of course, to go through who did what and when, but this map is a clear illustration of just how much the Confederates reconned this part of the field before Longstreet's July 2nd attack. What this map should make amply clear to you is that the issue is not the quantity of reconnaissance. It was, as McLaws emphasized, the want of proper reconnaissance. McLaws continued, quote, "It was assumed then from hasty reports, made probably by persons not skilled in such matters, that there was not much to be overcome, and this erroneous opinion was never corrected." The erroneous opinion to which McLaws referred was the false discovery during Johnston's early morning reconnaissance there was no federal force south of Cemetery Hill, no major federal force. It was on this mistaken belief or poor information that the Confederate High Command's entire battle plan on the southern end of the field was predicated. McLaws made this critical fact crystal clear a few times in his post-war commentary. Referring to Lee's decision calculus on July 2nd, McLaws wrote, quote, "I believe Lee, gave his orders for the movement of Longstreet's assault based on information obtained very early in the morning," unquote. In another instance, McLaws reiterated, quote, "General Lee must have given his orders for the attack based upon false information, or perhaps it would be better to say wrong information," unquote. Referring to Johnston's early morning report, McLaws further emphasized that if General Lee was relying on Johnston's report, he was misinformed as to the true condition of affairs, unquote. We know now that the Confederate High Command relied on Johnston's report right up until Longstreet began his attack around 4:30 p.m. Remember McLaws' commentary about what Longstreet alleged before the completion of the march, that there was nothing in McLaws' front and that he would be entirely on the Federal left flank. Also recall when Longstreet and Lee dismissed McLaws' concerns about what was in his front upon arriving on Lower Seminary Ridge. They had Longstreet staffer Latrobe tell him that nothing was in his front but a regiment of infantry and a battery of artillery. Then finally, bear in mind how Longstreet repeatedly told his other divisional officer, General Hood, in the lead up to the attack, that the time was up. General Lee's orders were to attack up the Emmitsburg Road. That order to attack up the Emmitsburg Road was a mere vestige born out of Johnston's early morning reconnaissance that was now extremely obsolete. As far as Federal forces were concerned at the beginning of Longstreet's attack, there was much position well back from or east of the Emmitsburg Road. Close adherence to those obsolete orders to attack up the Emmitsburg Road would result in exactly what happened. Brigades and regiments tried to balance adhering to outmoded orders while simultaneously attempting to react to the reality of a much changed situation. Collectively, this unfortunate situation for the Confederates resulted in disjointed and uncoordinated attacks over a much broader front than two infantry divisions with no rearward support could ever handle. So who did McLaws ultimately blame for these reconnaissance and intelligence failures? Was Longstreet solely to blame, as he alleged in his post-battle letter, and as historians have largely repeated over the decades? No. Upon reflection years later, McLaws thought that if after Johnston's early morning reconnaissance, quote, a different state of affairs was known by anybody to exist, it had not been reported to either General Lee or General Longstreet. At least it appears so, unquote. McLaws chalked up the entire mess to the, quote, defective and deficient organization of our staff corps, not from anybody's fault, but from the force of circumstances. The force of circumstances. Much different conclusion than the one McLaws advanced in his Longstreet-centric post-battle letter. These vast differences beg the question, why has McLaws' post-war commentary been inadequately included in Gettysburg historiography? It is indeed key testimony, and yet it has been left on the cutting room floor. The natural open-ended question then is, why? As we conclude, I'll leave that question up to you to ponder. Longstreet would finally come around on Knoxville. Of course, there was always signs that he knew he'd pinned the blame on McLaws unfairly. Most are unaware of this, but much like Lee did after Gettysburg, Longstreet requested he be relieved of command after Knoxville. On December 30th, 1863, Longstreet wrote to Confederate Adjutant and Inspector General Samuel Cooper, quote, "If this field is to be held with a view to future operations, I earnestly desire that some other officer be sent to the command. It is fair to infer that the fault is entirely with me, and I desire, therefore, that some other commander be tried," unquote. Revealingly, Longstreet wrote this just 13 days after he had relieved McLaws of his command and was preparing formal charges against him. When Longstreet and McLaws finally reconnected via letter in the summer of 1873, Longstreet admitted to McLaws that he had relieved him in what he described as a personal, quote, unguarded moment. But it wasn't until 1890, in an address at a reunion in Knoxville, that Longstreet publicly took sole blame for Knoxville. In October 1892, Longstreet wrote to McLaws, quote, "I think I have made it clear, as it was I who caused the failure at Knoxville. It is after the same course as pointed out in my Knoxville address 2 years ago," unquote. Between 1890 and 1895, Longstreet actively worked on his memoirs, ultimately titled From Manassas to Appomattox, and published in 1896. In it, he reflected at some length on McLaws and the post-Knoxville charges he made against him all those years ago. In the case of General McLaws, Longstreet wrote, "The court-martial ordered official reprimand, but the president disapproved of the proceedings, passing reprimand upon the court and the commanding general, and ordered the officer to be restored to duty, which was very gratifying to me, who could have taken several reprimands to relieve a personal friend of an embarrassing position. General McLaws was a classmate and had been a warm personal friend from childhood. I had no desire to put charges against him and should have failed to do so even under the directions of the authorities. I am happy to say that our personal relations are as close and interesting as they have ever been, and that his heart was big enough to separate official duties and personal relations." That's Longstreet there. This was a rather long-winded way of saying that Longstreet thought himself completely in the wrong for what he did to McLaws, and he was glad McLaws seemingly did not hold it against him. That said, Longstreet was probably a little too optimistic in his assessment of he and McLaws' personal relations in the post-war years. Their personal letters were professional and stiffly cordial enough. However, it's clear McLaws never fully forgave Longstreet. That much is evident in McLaws' correspondence with others, especially between the time Longstreet's memoirs were published in 1896 and McLaws' own sudden death in July 1897. It was clear something about Longstreet's memoirs raised McLaws' hackles yet again. There is a sense that McLaws thought Longstreet's memoirs to be self-serving at various points, and truth be told, like any other memoir, they were to some extent. In June 1897, just 1 month before his death, McLaws wrote rather bitterly of Longstreet's admission concerning Knoxville, quote, "Since my report of Knoxville was published in the official record, General Longstreet, in an address he made at a reunion at Knoxville, exonerated me from all blame for the failure at Knoxville, taking it all himself. But my report exonerates me, so his generosity comes too late," unquote. Indeed, it is clear Longstreet and McLaws' relationship remained rather complex and fractured to the very end. Given this reality, what should be equally clear is that McLaws had every reason to join the ranks of the post-war anti-Longstreet group of ex-Confederates who largely blamed Longstreet for the Confederates' failure at Gettysburg. However, it was very likely McLaws' internal nature that stopped him from doing so. Qualities that often served him well during the war: his attention to detail, his keeping of meticulous records, his methodical approach to decision-making, coupled with his ingrained aversion to joining factions, meant there was very little chance of him joining forces with the post-war anti-Longstreet group, not even to settle any personal scores. Just as McLaws insisted during a dark time in March 1864, he clearly demonstrated in his writings on the post-war Longstreet-Gettysburg controversy that he would make his own movement and on his own responsibility. It is for this reason, I believe, that we should consider Lafayette McLaws' post-war testimony to be some of the most objective commentary on this enduring controversy. McLaws' testimony is indeed key, with much of it challenging a great deal of the partialities written about Longstreet at Gettysburg since the 1870s. And with that, that concludes my presentation for the evening, and I thank you all for your attention. Take any questions?
Yes, well, I have a microphone here, and we'll take questions. Yes, let me give you the microphone.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk.
Yes, sir.
Question, it sounds like General Lee was around on the right with Longstreet observing this attack by McLaws.
At least initially.
Initially.
Yes, going into the attack. Yep.
Was there any paralysis at that point when they realized that there were more Union troops there? Was there any attempt to pivot or change orders at that time?
There was. So once Lee and Longstreet realized that the battlescape had been changed, and there indeed was a large federal force in their front up at the Emmitsburg Road, that was the reason why they siphoned Hood's division off to the right. So the initial plan for McLaws and Hood's division was for McLaws to lead the attack with Hood in support up the Emmitsburg Road. All that was changed once they noticed there was a large federal force out there. So they had to siphon Hood's, this was the decision they made within about an hour's time, to siphon Hood's division further off to the right. And then you have McLaws on the left and Hood on the right. That was not the initial plan. So that was the major alteration going into Longstreet's attack.
Let me give you a question that's from one of our members watching on YouTube. It's forces of circumstances. Sickles' early afternoon move to the Peach Orchard. The Confederates had no mechanism for obtaining up-to-date intel on last-minute movement of the Union forces. Do you agree that they just lacked
time? Yeah, by the time they got to Warfield Ridge and were about to initiate the attack, it was 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. Lee wanted the attack online, so they did, as I just described, they did make that last-minute alteration with Hood pushed over further to the right. But other than that, there really wasn't much time to do much else as far as detailed reconnaissance work goes.
Other questions? Yes.
Yes, sir.
It seemed like the current of McLaws's commentary was that Sickles showing up in the Peach Orchard somehow was a negative for the Confederates. But isn't it generally believed that that was a major mistake on Sickles' part for the Union, because he left himself exposed and didn't have a salient, and that resulted in a massive amount of carnage.
Yeah. Yes, sir. So that opens a major can of worms. That particular topic about Sickles' move out to the Peach Orchard. I'm not going to have time to address that whole thing. My point on that is, no, Sickles did not have orders to do that, but as events turned out, his move out to the Peach Orchard had grave effects on the Confederate attack on July 2nd, coupled with the fact that the Confederates had no real great understanding of the federal position on July 2nd. So those two factors really hampered the Confederate attack on July 2nd, and to the point where you had disjointed attacks and whatnot. But Sickles' flank actually was much further to the left, even than Devil's Den. He had units that were almost over to Bushman Hill, further to the south of the Slider Farm, that Law's brigade of Hood's division had to deal with. And so at that point, you have elements of Law's brigade going up on Big Ground Top into places that were never even imagined for Confederates to go on July 2nd. So you can say a lot about Sickles, but his move, no orders, so no one get too mad at me. Okay, he did not have clear orders to move out there, but as events turned out, it did have some pretty grave effects on the Confederate attack on July 2nd. So, does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah. So Sickles is the hero.
Coupled with the fact that the Confederates had no rearward support on July 2nd. So Longstreet was just attacking with his two divisions and with support from Andrews' division on the left of that, no Pickett's division on the second day. So no rearward support whatsoever to Longstreet's attack on July. Massive repercussions because of that.
We have another question.
Did we ever weigh in on the controversy between these two individuals?
I'm sorry, sir, could you speak up
The
just?
question is, did Lee ever weigh in on the controversy between McLaws and Longstreet?
He did not. No, he did not. No, Lee often did not go into a lot of detail on what he thought about the Battle of Gettysburg. He spoke very generally about it after the battle and in the post-war years.
Okay.
Yep.
Another question.
There are two things that I still have read about that are interesting concerning Longstreet, and whether he was sort of dragging his feet on the second day. One of them was when they were marching, they were in that concealed area, or unconcealed area, and they had to turn around.
Mhm.
That he ordered his corps to turn completely around, so that the first whoever it was, the first division had to be the first division still, so it delayed them further instead of just turning around backwards and going rear first, which would have been faster. The second thing was that Hood, as I recall, was critical of Longstreet, not allowing him enough independent command, if you will, to seize Little Round Top earlier. Because Hood saw that it was vacant, but Longstreet was insistent that he not move any troops over there. Are those two things valid?
Yeah, so thanks for your question, sir. Real quickly on those two questions. One of my essays in my recent book goes into a lot of detail on your first question regarding the turnaround point for the countermarch. There's been in Gettysburg historiography, especially in some of the one-volume histories, that point comes up, which I think is where people are getting it from, that you just do an about face with the countermarch and start leading with Hood instead of McLaws. But that's just simply not how countermarches were executed. So that's not how they were trained to execute a countermarch. So if you look at the tactical manuals of the time, which is what Longstreet and McLaws would have been looking at, that's how they would have executed a countermarch, not just a simple about face. Coupled with that fact is Longstreet countermarched based on McLaws' advice on July 2nd. So they were countermarching to a point that McLaws suggested. So it made more sense for McLaws to continue in the lead. And thirdly, McLaws was supposed to lead the attack on July 2nd. It didn't turn out that way. Hood's division led off the attack, but initially going in, McLaws' division was supposed to lead the attack on July 2nd. So it would have made much more sense for him to continue leading the column. On the second point with Little Round Top, all I'll say about that is Little Round Top was not a Confederate objective on July 2nd going into the attack. The first objective was the Peach Orchard. You can see that in General Lee's after battle reports. The second objective was Cemetery Ridge, to get a foothold in Cemetery Ridge. And the third objective was Cemetery Hill. So the attack was progressing up that way. Little Round Top was never designated a Confederate attack objective going into the second day's fight.
Is there any evidence that McLaws talked to other people in his command or others, and that helped to change his opinion regarding the events of July 2nd?
That's a great question. I do not know the answer to that one. I don't know what changed his mind. I just know that it's quite clear in comparing the different accounts between the post-battle letter and his post-war accounts that he had a lot of time to consider events, to think about events, and there's a lot of difference between what's in the post-battle letter and what's in his post-war commentary. I'm not sure exactly who he may have spoken to in post-wars. I'm sure he spoke to some of his brigadiers. Joseph Kershaw wrote quite a bit in the post-war years. Barksdale, of course, wouldn't have been around, but I know Kershaw certainly wrote quite a bit in the post-war years, so he may have consulted him. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Well, we have a final question here.
Can you give me a little bit of context for William Pendleton and his comments he might have made? You mentioned it twice.
Yeah. William Pendleton, is really one of the original instigators of the Sunrise. So he was Lee's chief of artillery during the war. Just to give you the context briefly on what he did during the war. Yeah. So after Lee's death, in January 1873, William Pendleton started going on a speaking tour where he brought up charges against Longstreet with the Sunrise attack claim that Lee had apparently ordered Longstreet to attack at sunrise on July 2nd. So William Pendleton and Jubal Early were the original instigators of that claim. And it's still around today, believe it or not. Some people still believe in that. It's interesting. But the funny thing about William Pendleton is when his official battle report was eventually unearthed and given to Helen Longstreet in the late 1880s and into the 1890s, it contradicts everything that William Pendleton said in the post-war years. So you can essentially just compare Pendleton's after battle report with what he says in 1873, and it's bogus.
Okay, I have his book, but I'll have to look to see the year that it was published.
Yeah.
If it's the before or after.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Cory, and we'll see everybody in January for the Ed Barr's Memorial event. We'll have Will Green here talking about leadership in Petersburg.
Thank you.